We are in kit 132A. And if you are joining us for the first time, thank you so much for being here. If you've been here before, welcome. We love to see you here. We love having our Master of the World community. And I don't know when we're going to stop doing webinars. You know, the whole world might decide that they only want to do live events, but we enjoy hanging out. I think the four of us so much that we're going to be here. So if you're here too, great. So welcome again. 132A kit, here we go. Madeline, we're going to have you take away on wine number one.
And I have to say, I love virtual as maybe an addendum to in-person life because nobody's in the back of the room. And I think that that's wonderful. So cheers to everyone. If you have 132A or a close version of it, we're going to have fun nonetheless. And I'm sure we can handle Q&A well. So that said, these questions are up here just in case you want your mind to hang on to something. They're not necessarily specific to this wine. So I wanted to make that clear. Though it's nice to, if you look at the second point, get in the habit of quantifying things like alcohol and getting a sense of your own ability to do that, to be able to judge it low, medium, or high, and ditto with the texture to be decisive about how the wine feels. So on to wine number one. Looking at it per usual, because not to rob ourselves of many deductive helpful hints and also, you know, completes the experience of the wine. This to me is quite simply a pale yellow, and it definitely has green glints. I love this time of year because it doesn't get dark till 9 o'clock, right? So I can see the wine very clearly in my room, and it's exceptionally bright. And it moves with some viscosity in the glass. I'm not going to worry too much about the tearing action. And just to remind us all, when it comes to white wine, unless it's, there's exceptional residual sugar and or alcohol in it, it's not uncommon for it to sheet or for the legs not to command our attention. And aromatically, it's very forthcoming, very generous and immediate. And I just get this wave of fresh flowers immediately that's, I'm trying to push them out of the way so I can smell other things. It's glorious. Now my wine actually is not terribly cold, so that's probably one of the reasons why. And right on the heels of apple blossoms, lemon and lime blossoms, pretty honeysuckle, pretty is the word that immediately flips into my mind, are sweet citrus notes, notably Meyer lemon, key lime, that type of thing. And I'm going to actually take it on the palate momentarily. I really like to talk about the nose and the palate because they really are one and the same, but the nose is so compelling. I want to mention also some tree fruits, specifically crisp apples, honey crisps, green apple. And I think I get a little bit of peach and nectarine and green melon as well. And all of this is, in the lap of a wonderful floral and sweet citrus aroma. Let's go ahead and take it on the palate. The attack is very different than the finish. And sometimes it's useful, especially on wine number one, if the acidity is running vervy or high, to immediately taste it again so that your palate can get used to the acidity and assess it in a moderate way. But, mid-palate, what I get is very much a reflection of what I was smelling. So it's floral on the palate as well, like chewing on fresh flowers. Plenty of both the green apple and slightly underripe pear. There's the peach, there's the nectarine. So the fruits are coming more to the fore, though the floral is there as well. In terms of, I'm going to take it on the palate just the way I counseled you to, just to assess this acidity realistically. The wine is so delicious that I actually swallowed a chunk automatically. The acidity is mouth-watering, so I would definitely call it, frankly, high at this showing, or possibly medium plus. And right on the heels of that, you get very distinctive that hackneyed adjective or noun, I should say, minerality. So basically, we have an inorganic earth component that is very present on the palate. and it comes in the form of a stony rockiness right in the middle of the wine. And also, frankly, now that I'm tasting it, a smell of salinity. So you have very strong floral, citrus, tree fruit, stone fruit, and inorganic earth. And additionally, I'm getting senses of some herbs, which are mostly citrus related, lemongrass, sorrel, verbena. And if I were to put my finger on some spice, I would say a little bit of ginger. So there is an illusion of sweetness on this wine as well, but the acidity is what's compelling and what really pulls the wine into terrific length. It is bone dry, acidity is high, alcohol is balanced, medium, I think. I really wouldn't even put it in medium plus. No phenolic character to this wine. And it's absolutely delicious, and it's crying for a little bit of, olive oil or fat so it can cut through it and soften up a little bit. Let's go to the next slide, Li Meng. So this is very interesting because we have aromatic grape varieties across the board. Sauvignon Blanc or a blend, Albarino, aka Alvarinho, and Viognier. And I would say, certainly Albarino and Viognier are famous for their florality, for presence of both fresh and dried flowers. Sauvignon Blanc tends to have more of a pronounced citrus element that, scooches closer to pink and white grapefruit. But I think that this is not an easy call by anybody's measure. So you're going to have to turn to your ability to deduce. But I would say, if I were to give a little bit of a hint, the minerality that I got, were I really tasting this double blind, which we know I'm not because I know what the wine is, would at least have me strongly consider the old world. Doesn't mean that New Zealand and California can't show salinity and inorganic earth as well. Viognier tends to have a purity in its floral component. Albarino, officially we call it like a semi-aromatic variety, but it really depends on its expression. And Sauvignon Blanc, again, just the way we mentioned, has a very strong presence of white citrus. All three of them. Oh, this is one more thing before we go to the next slide. If you go to the mouthfeel, because I counseled you to pay attention to it and I didn't define it myself. I would say that this particular wine has a lean and tart mouthfeel. Viognier tends to have sufficient acidity, but tends to run softer. Sauvignon Blanc, if the acidity is not medium plus running high, to me is disappointing. And Albarino, medium plus to high acidity, depending on the expression. So I would say the one outlier here in terms of mouthfeel where it classic would be the Viognier.
Mm-hmm. Maddie, just going back as people think, we do have the same prompts in the chat. And of course, the chat, it might feel a little exposed, but we're all amongst friends here. It's a small group, so we're all here to learn together. If you want to throw out your answers on chat, that's great. But here's a question for you, Maddie. Can you say a few words categorizing brightness? How do you look at brightness of a wine, especially a white wine?
I'm happy to. And I just, by the way, pulled up, the chat is starting to work for me. So yay, I'll address that as well. To me, brightness is just how the wine is reflecting light. And also I want to say that if a wine is not necessarily bright or brilliant, it's not a mark of, it's not a negative mark. I mean, sometimes winemakers are very particular about, racking off the lees, not polishing the wine at all. So even a white can be verging on dull and still be a quality wine. But this particular wine, makes me smile because it's reflecting light beautifully. I wouldn't call it, if I were pushed to it, brilliant, but I would call it very bright. So hopefully that's helpful. And it's not, again, I'm observing it. I'm not making a quality call. And somebody brought up, we have a lot of Albarino discussion here. We had one option for Mâconnais. And we have someone mentioned Gewürztraminer. And the one thing I would say about Gewürz is absolutely it can have a dominant, even obnoxious florality to it in terms of, verging on unattractive perfume, depending on the quality of the wine. But the one thing it doesn't have that I've ever experienced is acidity like this. It tends to be soft, even verging on deficient. And depending on where it's grown, I think the alcohol can pull your attention too. So you have a much fatter, softer mouthfeel and even an illusion of sweetness. So hopefully that's useful.
Great. And Maddie, do you feel like the candiedness of the aroma, does that give you do you get that candiedness? This is a great comment from Venkat. Is there a candiedness to it that might be pulling you to new world instead of old world?
To me, I must admit, I wouldn't define it as candied personally, but now that it's said, I can understand why you would think that, because there is, once you get past the mouthfeel and the citrus and the flowers, there is a sweetness to the fruit, an illusion of sweetness to the fruit. But no, that to me is just, everywhere in the world now you can get blazing sunshine, high ripeness levels, it's just an issue of the ripeness of the fruit to me. What puts me more in the old world in general is that strong presence of inorganic earth, whether you want to call it river rocks or salinity or a stoniness mid-palate. I like that word. I heard that was on a description that Kermit Lynch threw out recently about one of his wines, and I like that. So, again, we can all be fooled because the new world can have that as well.
Great. So well, let's see where we are. We're leaving from San Francisco.
Yay, and we're taking your flight, but we're not going to end up in the Rhone where it's going to be over 100 degrees. We are going to Iberia. We are going to Rías Baixas. So we're in northwestern Spain. We are actually within hailing distance of the Atlantic because we are in the Val d'Salnes specifically. So, just to remind us all, Rías Baixas has multiple appellations, but Val d'Salnes is right up against the Atlantic. And bravo to everyone who was, just tromping over to Albariño. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful example. This is an area that has, maritime influence up the kazoo. So it is very rainy, right? It is very moist. And in the past, most of the vineyards were trained up on pergolas, but now it's not uncommon especially for Albariño, to see a combination of regular training techniques, meaning closer to the ground, and pergola. So it is allowable to tuck other grape varieties in here, but this is 100% Albariño from Rías Baixas, specifically Val d'Salnes. It is made by a sister team, Carmen and Marta Castro. And I love this comment that Marta makes, that she makes wine without makeup. So she's not manipulating anything, just straightforward, simple winemaking. And I think when you look at this beautiful view, you can see a combination of pergola training and others here. And then a nice classic European cellar with larger barrels that are undoubtedly used. I mean, and to that point, they don't claim any oak on this wine. Marta specifically saying that she makes wine without makeup, though occasionally you will see, particularly ultra premium examples of Rías Baixas Albariño that have seen some oak. That annoys me slightly, but as long as it doesn't interfere with the expression or the typicity of the wine, I'm okay with it. What else to tell you about this producer or about Albariño in general? This, the poignant acidity on this specific wine. Oh, look at the verdure here, the greenery. You say taprasina in Greek, all the green. This is an area of the world that has no problem getting plenty of moisture to grow things, right? If anything, they have to struggle probably with controlling humidity levels, but you have all that wonderful maritime influence in the form of winds coming in from the Pacific. But I was going to say, you could have considered Riesling here. We didn't put it in the options, but because of that poignant acidity, think of other grape varieties that give you that mouthfeel. Certainly Riesling, Chenin Blanc, but that combination of flowers and high acidity, one could, veer a little bit into Mosel land. Green apple and fresh flowers and high acidity to me is a thumbprint of Riesling. And actually, this grape variety, Albarino, speaks to Alba place and Rino, the Rhine. So originally it tied it to Germany and to the Rhine in general. I think it's a beautiful example, albeit the acidity is a little bit surprising for me. And the winery calls it crunchy and snappy, which might be, I'm curious to see how they say that in Spanish.
I love that comment that Tim just put out there, Albarino as a Viognier nose and a Riesling palate. Well said. One question here finishes. New world equals fruit, old world equals mineral. Is that a correct statement?
I don't think it's, I don't think it's correct or incorrect. To me, it's the length of the finish. And then you can usually, I think Tim answered it usually. Is that the answer to that? But, to me, it's the length that I pay attention to. That's a qualitative call. And then if the minerality persists to the point that it's impossible not to pay attention to it, chances are the bell is ringing Europe. But certainly modern expressions of wines can speak to plenty of fruit as well, and in these days when everything can be verging on quite ripe. Sure. So.
And Tim, education is always about the exceptions, right? I love it. I love it.
Absolutely.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
I think then, unless you guys wanted to add anything else, Evan, let's get on.
I was just going to say it might be interesting just for a moment. And Madeline, since this is your wine, let's throw it at you first, then we can take it afterwards. I often get the question of what is the difference, flavor profile, if any, or structurally, if any, between Albarino, as we see it in Spain, and Alvarinho, as we see it coming from the Minho and the Vinho Verde area. What's been your experience in terms of trying to?
You've tasted a lot more of, the latter than I have. If anything, I've had people ask me, to distinguish it from Gruner Veltliner. And I will speak to that very briefly, but frankly, both Gruner and sorry to pivot for a second, both Gruner, and we're talking really good examples, and Alvarinho from Spain will have a heft to them. And be, semi-aromatic, if not highly aromatic. But I find that that Gruner definitely has more vegetal elements in the form of celery and radish, and more spice elements like white pepper. And the florality on Albarino is definitely more compelling with fewer herbs. So that said, you can take the ball and talk to Albarino.
Absolutely. First and foremost, and just as the little chat things, I can only answer them when I see them pop up on my screen. But yes, Albarino and Alvarinho are identical grapes, the way Pinot Gris and Grigio are, Sauvignon Blanc and Fumé Blanc are, etc. But I think your observation of richness and texture, to me, are usually the biggest drivers. Now, you can take Alvarinho a la somebody like Anselmo Mendes and put a ton of lees on it and, do a much.
But he's not
higher,
normal, right?
And he's not normal, exactly. He's making a wine that's probably closer to Albarino in style, which, interesting, this Albarino you have is probably closer to Alvarinho in style, in terms of the sense that usually they tend to be a little bit leaner. They tend to be more acid driven. The fruit, while classically, bordering on the tree fruit and the orchard fruits, is not going to be as it's quieter. It's not quite as flamboyant, whereas they can be that way in the land of Spain and in the Rías Baixas. But they are, of course, very, very close by definition. And once again, probably the hardest to peg when they are pure. Oftentimes they are indeed blended with other, cousin grapes like, Trajadura and things like that. Trajadura in Spain, Trajadura in Portugal, which might change it and make it different. But
So
the
Evan,
purity,
are you just trying to
Mhm.
say that the Albarino and Alvarinho really
Mhm.
pointing to maybe Spanish winemaking traditional style versus
No,
Portuguese?
it's actually usually more to do with ripeness in anything. Monsão and Melgaço just simply, in my historic opinion, don't get necessarily as ripe and ergo as round and rich as the ones do from Spain. So it's, again, it's sort of like Madeline was saying before. One's not better than the other; they're just sort of different. Very much like Pinot Gris from Alsace and Pinot Grigio from Italy are two different children of the same parent.
Yeah.
Somebody asked about Lee's contact, and it's a matter of course, I think, with wine like this, and it certainly lends a richness to it, but it isn't necessarily a stamp of recognition. But I will say what is stunning to me about this wine is its length. I mean, it really swells, and that's where the minerality is really compelling. And there is not a disconnect. We're a very different expression from the finish. And mid palate are more closely allied, and the aromatics, which are a brass band, but very high quality wine.
All right. Evan, wine number 2. We got to keep time here.
Absolutely. Moving on to wine number 2, it's interesting, and I'd encourage you, since you have the luxury of doing it, of going a little bit back and forth with wine number 1. I think the first thing that look from the standpoint of color, the color is a bit richer on the second wine. It's pushing a little bit more golden on wine number 2, and not as just sort of bright and sort of soft yellow as it is on the first one. The nose itself is not quite as bright in the sense of you've got all of this sort of floral and citrus and sharp fruit character on the first wine. The second wine is sort of like you took the volume knob and turned it back a hair, because there's still a lot going on there, but it doesn't sort of just attack your nose in the same way that the first wine did. In terms of what I'm getting within the nose of this wine, I always again remind people, don't overthink this, look for a few things: F, fruit; E, earth; W, wood, if any, and then any other players to be named later that you want to talk about. The fruit here I get is definitely in the sort of orchardy fruit thing, sort of that apple pear element, and I'm getting it in sort of several different levels. So I'm getting both fresh fruit, ripe fruit. I'm getting stuff that's verging more on the area of like poached fruit, or perhaps even baked fruit in that regard, but all sort of spectrums off of the same theme. There is citrus here, as Madeline's was, and it's probably more on the sweeter side of citrus too. Perhaps the faintest note of something like tangerine, or maybe lemon curd rather than lemon fruit or something like that. Again, sort of pushing the riper element of that. I'm not getting as much of the tree fruit thing to say. So, if there is nectarine or peach or something like that, it's definitely on the fresh side. It's not super flamboyant, and I'm definitely not getting anything tropical, if you will. As far as the sort of veggie or non-earth spectrum goes, let's start with flowers. Definitely getting some blossoms here. Once again, probably more in that kind of apple blossomy, ripe lemon or citrus blossomy thing, but all in that sort of spectrum of white blossoms there. As far as vegetables go, if anything, maybe I'm getting this very faint hint of, as Madeline said before, a little bit of ginger root, which is not as sharp as ginger powder would be for an example. But I'm also picking up just the faintest little hint of fresh, first of the season white corn, which picks up sort of a ripe sweet thing, but is not corny. Literally corny, if that makes any sense to you, and not as distant as sort of like popcorn or caramel corn or anything like that, which clearly would steer me in a whole different direction. Herbal things for sure. A little bit of perhaps lemongrass, a little bit of verveine or verbena, as we talked about before. Maybe the faintest hint of something leafy underneath, like maybe a bay leaf or a laurel leaf or something like that. And then I move into the minerality. So we did the fruit. Let's talk the earth here. And there's definitely, to me, a very distinctive, strong presence of place, if you will. Here it comes off to me as being slightly organic, like button mushrooms or something like that, but really more inorganic, i.e. rock. And in this case, it really comes off to me as sort of a limestone or chalkier character, maybe not as stony or stoned like that one, as the first wine that Madeline had, but definitely a little bit stony and richness. As far as wood goes, I do get a sense that there's wood here, but I don't get a sense that the wood is commanding my attention. So it's either older or larger or some combination thereof, but it seems to have the pedigree of something smaller, or maybe a combination there, but again, not new, not flamboyant, not in your sort of face sort of thing. Then let's go ahead and palette, reaffirm all this back, talk about structure, and then we'll move forward. Palette pretty much reaffirms just about everything I said. Again, I'm maybe picking up some notes of more green apple and quince than I talked about before. I was getting more sort of that yellow appley, yellow brown pear character in the nose, and I'm getting a little bit more shrill in the palette. However, saying that, and then all the other elements follow through, definitely getting that sort of limestone character there. And I'm getting it both in terms of flavor, but also in terms of texture. There's a very slight pull or grittiness here, as if somebody who's old enough can remember when you clopped your erasers to do the chalkboard and you got sort of a film in your mouth. I pick up a little bit of that with this wine here. It's very reflective, again, of this sort of spectrum of tree and orchard fruit. As far as the structural components go, and actually I'm picking up, I'm sorry, two other points before I go to the structural point. One, I'm picking up something that I can only recognize as sort of like a leasiness to the wine. And that comes up sort of at a combination of one, sort of this matchsticky element, which is at once partially suggests reductive or non-oxygened winemaking, minimalizing that, but also as lees break down over time, they tend to give off that sort of matchsticky autolytic character, which can also come off as being nutty. It can also come off as being slightly cheese rindy, maybe a little yogurty or something like that. But all of those things together speak to me to the presence of lees, and also just that little bit of sort of like when you're at the baseball game and you're eating the peanuts and you're throwing the shells everywhere, that last smell that you get before you pull the nut out and throw the shell on the ground, you get a little bit of that too. Texturally, I'm picking up some roundness to the wine, so definitely it has a texture. It's got bright acid, but it's definitely round. The body weight, ergo the alcohol, is probably somewhere in the medium, plus perhaps even leaning towards medium on the wine. The oak, as I said before, not important. No phenols here, which would suggest either extended time in oak or skin contact, neither of which I'm picking up here. And the length on the wine is incredibly persistent, and the palate itself quite expansive. This is a wine of filigree and a wine of gravitas, if you will, and suggests somebody who knows exactly what their intent and what they're doing is with the fruit by which they were given that harvest.
What's filigree?
Filigree, pedigree, sort of
Gotcha.
that whole sort of thing there. And then, you know, is it dry or fruity? It's definitely dry, and the fruit is, I think, subdued. And it does have floral components, although not as much as Madeline's. More in that appley vein, as I said before. And the texture is round, but with a nice backbone of structure through its acidity there. So speaks with a singular voice, I might add. So my hit right off the bat is it's probably not a blend.
Evan, I will never, ever be able to describe wine as specifically as you can. That moment where you take that peanut shell off, I mean, in a baseball game, that is amazing.
Yeah,
I love
you
it.
do it. I mean, if you put it right in front of your face like I do, and you pull it apart and you bite the nut out of the shell, but you're still smelling the shell, that's what it is, right? And there's difference between, by the way, that's different. That's sort of like the roasted peanut as opposed to like Virginia boiled peanuts. That's a whole different thing. But we won't go there today. This is not a peanut.
You know, this is giving me a little bit of PTSD for when we first established a grid, Tim, with Evan and Maddie, and we're sitting there arguing about what should be listed on there. And Evan's got like 20 billion descriptors, and Maddie's going, we don't
eliminate half of them because most people won't get what you're getting.
I love it.
I had Jamie Good say that to me when I was up in Niagara about a week and a half ago. Just use too many words, Evan. All right. So what do we got varietally here? Well, we certainly have two grapes that are more in this sort of non-aromatic vein, to which oftentimes winemaking brings more out of them. They tend to be fairly low key and shy by themselves. Those being Chardonnay, which is oftentimes accompanied by a richer texture, oftentimes because of that least contact and such, and Pinot Blanc, also known as Pinot Bianco, which tends to be a relatively white canvas, picking up anything it can from everywhere it can. And then you have, of course, Torrentes, which is the complete opposite, a supremely aromatic variety that tastes like it smells, which is literally sort of when you get off that flight landing in Kauai and somebody puts a lei on your around your neck, and you get in the car and you're so intoxicated by the smell that you immediately drive right into the farmer's market next door, and all those tropical fruits jump out at you too, and you smell the fruit and the flowers, and that's Torrentes. And then, of course, it could be somewhere else in between, but you're definitely leaning in two spectrums. And then obviously associated countries with their older world, Spain and France being perhaps more for the Chardonnay element of things, Pinot Blanc being for the French, Argentina actually being for all three of those, in Australia, at least for the first one and the third one. I'm not aware of people doing Torrentes in Australia there. Shoot.
First of all, we've got a very courageous crowd over here who just throws out the answers, and I love it. And I don't know whether to be excited that these people are tasting so well. Do they even need our kits? Or be excited that using our kids, they're getting better and better at tasting, that they're just throwing it out there. But Evan, two questions. One is, here is a comment, dimethyl sulfide corn from Andrea. Are you getting that?
Well, I said I picked up a little bit of white corn there before. To me, and I don't want to get overly geeky, but yellow corn gives you both more of a truly sucrosey thing. You know, corn syrup that they flavor everything with is usually with yellow corn. It's not made with white corn. White corn gets a little bit more just sort of a sweetness, a generic sweetness to it that usually I consider to be a lift, while picking up sort of a sweet vegetable element, maybe kind of like jicama or something without the bite. As far as the actual other stuff we associate with corn, like popcorn, like malolactic fermentation, et cetera, if it is there, it's there very much in the back. You know, ML doesn't always have to scream to you like a bag of caramel corn. It can be more subtle in interpretation, depending on where in the world and depending on the nature of the strain of malolactic bacteria that's being used.
And then Evan, the other question is, there is one, I love it. Thank you, Ben, for the very courageous Pinot Blanc vote here. Pinot Blanc, what are the markers for Pinot Blanc really?
Pinot Blanc is relatively neutral. You know, to me, it's going to be a combination of some citrus, depending on how warm the climate is, riper to unripe. You might pick up some relatively neutral tree fruits as well, too. Again, you know, green apples from Safeway as opposed to green apples from the flower market into the market, because you bite into them and they're sort of acid, but not a lot of flavor to them. And then I usually pick oftentimes these lactic things. I will oftentimes find a bit of sour cream. I might find some creme fraiche. I might find some plain yogurt in there. Again, all of which have interesting nuances, none of which are super expressive. And when Pinot Blanc is well done, it will give you floral notes also, but it's not a particularly complex grape by itself. Which is why you don't see a lot of it, you know, made. And even a lot of the Pinot Blanc that is labeled as Pinot Blanc in Alsace isn't Pinot Blanc. So. All
right. So on that note, I think that the corn is taking us as the biggest clue that we've got here. We're going to leave.
Bye-bye, España. It's at least it's cool up in the Rías Baixas as opposed to the rest of Spain, which is over 100 degrees everywhere today. Ditto Portugal. We're going up north. We're going to France, and we're going into Burgundy, and we're going specifically into the Mâconnais area of Burgundy, to the lovely little estate of Franz Chagnolot, who is a diehard man of the Mâconnais. And what I love about this wine, aside from the fact that Mâcon wines are among some of the only qualitative, affordable Burgundy that we have left with us today, is he shows you, as a number of other producers do these days, that because, number one, the Côte d'Or is a delimited area and there's just not a lot of land left and not a lot for sale, and what is there is expensive, and as such, over the price point of most of us on a day-to-day basis, you can produce super high quality wines in Burgundy in areas that are not in the Côte d'Or, whether you're in the Mâconnais, further north to the Côte Chalonnaise, et cetera. And the Mâconnais, I think, Mâconnais is an area that really excites me these days. I think this is where the action is. I think this is where the energy is going. And in fact, this wine will sort of bridge that. Franz Chagnolot. Franz is a gentleman. He is of the area. He's originally from Mâcon, although his professional career took him both to California, where he worked with Mr. Koningsgaard Newton before he left to go do his own thing. And he worked as well in other parts of Burgundy, most notably further north in the Meursault area with Dominique Lafont of Comte Lafont. Now, his actual day-to-day winemakers are women by the name of Caroline Gon, G-O-N, and Caroline's most recent job was actually as the winemaker for Dominique Lafont in his literally game-changing project of the Héritier de Comte Lafont, which is a Mâconnais-based project that he's done down there. So you have two people that are coming to you from the Mâcon camp, but also from the school of Dominique Lafont, who believes in long-time lees aging, a bit of reduction, and that sort of matchsticky character in wine, big on texture, low on volume of fruit, and allowing really the place to shine through, which this wine, I believe, does. It is, Saint-Pancras is essentially sort of an unofficial sort of lieu dit, speaking to a primary vineyard and then an adjacent area, hence the village. It's not a single vineyard wine. Villages is the number, all the villages there that work together, but it's located not too far away from Montagne de Clessé, which is near the area of Viray. And it's about, I want to say maybe a little over 750 feet of altitude, and just pristine vineyards, pristine winemaking, and really running the gamut here. For those of you who've been paying attention, we did show this wine in a prior vintage over about a year ago at this point in time, and it was so beloved. We actually had it alongside, I remember, of a Patson Hall Sonoma Coast Chardonnay, and James Hall was so complimentary about this wine that I kept that in my brain, and the fact that I loved it, and I know Madeline and Tim love it too, that when the new vintage was out, I was like, hell, I'm putting this wine back in. So this is France, and then Carolina, as you can see over Ms. Gon to his right, and they are a lovely team. I don't know if they're a couple or not, so I'm not going to venture into that world. Oh, they are. Okay. Well, then they're also a lovely couple, both of whom are winemakers, both of whom work in the same property, which is both wonderful and potentially dangerous if they ever disagree.
I want to just jump in to say, if nothing
What
else.
are you saying about Barbara? I just,
All blind tasting aside, this to me is an exceptional example of a Mâcon. I tried to source this wine the minute I tasted it. It is Skurnik. It's nice to know importers, and which master the world, God bless you, always put on their peel and reveal labels. But to me, it is just textbook in terms of a non-aromatic variety, just mostly used oak, beautiful, low yield Chardonnay. And by the way, to that point, Pinot Blanc being a non-aromatic variety, it's easy if they were, apples to apples and Chardonnay is unoaked. You can confuse Pinot Blanc and Chardonnay. So they're not, far apart from each other, but this is worth memorizing in terms of its richness. And it really speaks to Evan's point that, Mâcon can be A++. I will argue with you actually gently on just one point, and I don't know if Tim agrees. To me, it does have a little bit of a phenolic character. It changes the texture of my palate, which isn't a good or bad thing. It could be with minimal skin contact in or a little bit of the neutral oak, but boy, everybody, A+ French Chardonnay.
Tim, anything you want to add before you lead us into wine 3?
Yeah, Andrea made a good comment about DMS, dimethyl sulfide, which is a sulfur compound. And Evan, you connected the dots because you said, this is very typical Burgundian winemaking in that you've got cold cellars, you've got lees contact, you've got topped up barrels, and you've got a very slow, gentle process of autolysis, lees contact, and you're going to get sulfur compounds from that. And DMS is one of them, and mercaptan is another one that smells like lit wooden matches. So yeah, good call, Andrea. Yeah. All right.
Awesome.
Are we ready to do something completely different?
Yes, let's go for it.
All right, we're on to wine number 3, which is red. And I mean, the first thing I'm looking at over a white background is the intensity of color, because the first sorting process that you go through blind tasting is you look at a red wine and said, okay, is it a lighter pigmented, thinner skin, relatively speaking, grape? Or is it a thicker skin, deeper pigmented grape? And this is the former. So this is a lighter colored red wine. I can see through it, right? Okay, so that means my universe got a little bit smaller in terms of my conclusion. Otherwise, it's a very pretty ruby red, medium ruby. It lightens up to a lighter ruby pink rim, showing us that the wine's fairly young. What else about it? You know, if I do this number, first of all, the tears legs, Marangoni effect, viscosity is a solid medium. And then there's very little, if any, staining of the tears. So once again, pointing that this grape, whatever it is, doesn't have a lot of pigmentation. Okay, on to the main event. So on the nose, lots going on. I think it's fruit dominant, but there's a lot of non-fruit savory type things going on as well. The fruit is predominantly red. So it is sour cherry, underripe strawberry, cranberry, maybe some red raspberry. There is un poquito, there's a touch of black fruit, and that's blackberry or black raspberry, very high-toned, acidic, tart black fruit. So in other words, again, my expectations from this, even looking at the wine, is that unless it's an anomaly, meaning that it's a thinner skinned grape grown in a really hot climate, it's going to be a temperate climate, excuse me, which means you're going to have elevated acidity, restrained alcohol, and more savory things. What else about it? The condition of all the fruit is fresh and ripe and even tart. And I think a really even balance between tart and ripe. In fact, when you taste it, you'll notice the wine does change considerably from the nose to the palate, and it's just tartar on the palate. All right, other than that, the savory, what the Brits call savory, non-fruit things, there's quite a bit going on. So I think there is tea leaf. It reminds me of black tea. There is tangerine or mandarin peel, and it's fresh. And it even reminds me of a Negroni. I'm thinking ahead of 6 o'clock my time. Anyway, sorry, got carried away there. What else? There's a little bit of dark leafy greens, maybe like arugula. And there's some brown button mushrooms. There's some anise. There's some red licorice. What else about it? Maybe a little bit of tomato leaf. And then in terms of earth and mineral, here, I think there is some. Mainly there is the button mushroom and earth quality, not so much the mineral stony quality at all. But I want you to take it in terms of the percentages of what you're being presented on the nose, and especially the palate. The fruit really dominates, although there are some earth and savory, notes as well. Okay, this is important to keep in mind when you try to home in on where this wine could be from. What else about it? There's definitely some oak aging. It is mixed. It's predominantly used. I do notice that the texture is rounded, really takes the edge off the acidity, and we'll get to that in a second, which is elevated. And there's some very subtle spice characteristics, maybe a touch of vanilla. There's definitely walnut. And then in terms of winemaking type things, I think even with the color, I'm looking at the color being, very youthful, but there could be some partial whole cluster fermentation on here. And there's definitely some stem inclusions because there's a green tannic quality to the mid palate of the wine. Okay, I'm going to retaste it. As your attorney, I advise you to retaste it for the structure. Okay, go ahead. Right, so it's just delicious wine. It's really high quality fruit. It is very good winemaking. It is seamless. Everything progresses without any glitches, really nothing out of balance. The harmony is wonderful, finishes long. Alcohol here is moderate, maybe a little above 13.5-ish, something in that range. The acid, notice your salivary glands are working, and it finishes with tart fruit, so medium plus in the acid. And then the tannin, somewhere between medium plus. And notice the quality of the tannins, it's soft. Hence my description of the wine being very pretty. Okay, finishes long, complexity is medium plus, headed to high, and just a wine I wouldn't hesitate to have a glass or two of. It's really delicious. Okay,
Now,
so
Tim, a couple questions. So first one is, what do you mean when you say partial whole cluster? Is it partial or is it whole? How can you explain that whole terminology?
yes. So what it means is, look, you're bringing all these grapes in, okay? And they can be in big containers or small containers, depending on what it is and how delicate the grape is, meaning that you don't want to bruise it or break all the grape skins and then bad things happen. Okay, so then you've got it, and then you have a choice. You can put all these grapes through a destemmer crusher, in which case, you know, you want to get the skins in contact with the juice like ASAP because you want color. Or maybe it's not a grape where you want to do that, in which case you take whole clusters of grapes and you put them in a stainless steel tank, probably, usually, or maybe a large barrel. And from there, you know, you're going to let gravity do its thing. So the grapes on the bottom are going to get crushed by the grapes on the top. And then you got two things going on. You've got what's called semi-carbonic or whole cluster fermentation. So you've got the skins and juice at the bottom, and then you got the skins, the whole grapes at the top. Notice all that presupposes that the grapes are being still held together by stems. So that's what it means. And you, the winemaker, have all sorts of choices there, because you can go completely whole cluster or partial whole cluster, depending how much of the very fruity character you get from whole cluster and how much stem tannin do you want. Okay. Nothing like a short question with a long answer.
No, well, I mean, I was just going to say, so the short version of that is whole cluster is another way of saying stem inclusion. So if there's partial whole
Yes.
cluster, there's partial stem inclusion. I like it simple,
Always.
but you were very
Yes.
expressive. Thank you.
Yeah, and long-winded.
No, it's
No,
great.
it's very helpful. Here's another question for Venkat. I love this question. I thought the tannins were slowly building. Would you say soft tannins usually build slowly in your mouth, or are these distinct things? You know, soft versus slow. I think they are distinct.
Yeah, Venkat, that's a tough question to answer. You know, soft tannins, you know, tannin, accumulates, and, you know, you get enough oak in and you get a tannic grape, and it's just like accentuates. They really enforce each other. I would say that, you know, it depends on you and your palate. Some people are very sensitive to tannin. I'm somewhere in the middle. This grape, you know, I would just say that I guess the true test for you is after you taste this wine half a dozen times, you know, does it seem to get more tannic? And for me, it doesn't. It just stays really right in the sweet spot. Yeah, the tannins here are soft. If anything, the acidity here is elevated, and it might exacerbate the tannins for you. Okay.
That's a great point. So I want to address this before we reveal. How would you tell whether this is old world or new world? We have got a lone Shannon, very courageous, new world throw in here for Oregon. And everyone else,
Yeah.
I think, is virtually on the old world, almost all French path.
Okay.
If you will.
All right. So that's a great question, Li Meng. And look, I think the safest way to answer that for all of you old world fans is that we're going to wait to the end of these three red wines. And then I won't have to answer it, but I'll just say what drives the wine. Okay. And again, I talk about that, you know, the sense of percentages. Is there more fruit than more savory things? And is there more fruit than savory and especially earthy things? Or does a combination of savory and earth outweigh how much fruit that you get?
How about
Because
complexity,
again,
Tim? Does complexity pull
well,
you in one
okay.
direction or another?
It could, and it usually does, but not always. Yeah, Maddie, good point. Because usually, you know, if you're adding the earth and mineral factor to a wine, any wine,
That's another thing.
You've increased the complexity,
Right.
you know, probably twofold or threefold. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let me look. Maybe we should reveal, and then I'm going to talk
I
about
think so. I think we
Yeah.
should reveal.
Yeah.
Ah,
Now, this is lovely wine. That's the important part.
here we go. So we're going from France.
Hi, France.
And we are, for those of you who are expecting France, we're leaving France.
Bye.
And we're actually going back
Yeah.
to the Americas and going back to the New World.
Bravo, the brave person.
Yeah, way to go,
Yay.
Sharon.
Shannon,
Yeah.
a great job. Domain Roy Efi, we are in Oregon.
Yeah. So this is, just to me, a really beautiful expression of Oregon Pinot Noir. And, before, we got on here, we were talking about, trying to pigeonhole the style of Oregon Pinot Noir, and I'm not sure you can do it. It's, the Oregon Pinot Noir, especially just the Willamette Valley now with 7 AVAs in it. So many differences in elevation and soil types and aspect and all that stuff, which is why AVAs exist, right? But it's almost like the Willamette Valley is all of California for Pinot Noir in a much smaller space. So the fabric, if we want to call it that, of Oregon Pinot Noir is very complex. And there are different styles. Certainly the inexpensive wines are very tutti frutti and just lovely everyday drinking wines. Madeline was talking about how, you get these single vineyard wines that are so tight and so wound up that they need 3 to 5 to 7 years to unwind, or you need to decant them and drink them the next day, or you need to, have them with pork belly or something with serious fat and salt. Okay.
Tim, can you speak to one thing? Because I think it's really important, and it's come up 2 or 3 times in the chat room, if you don't mind. Assuming the highest level of Cru Beaujolais, meaning not carbonic, meaning traditional Burgundian production methods, why not Gamay versus Pinot? And
So
this is
hard.
for my elevation.
I
but,
agree.
for my
That's
illumination.
for me was the hardest part of this one.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, number one, think about the earth factor. Cru Beaujolais, frankly, are going to be a richer wine than this. They're going to be profoundly earthy. They're going to have higher acidity. The fruit profile is different. But the earth factor, is really, really considerable. Okay, so I want to talk about this winery. This is Maison Roy and Vie, and it is Marc-Andre Roy and Jared Etzel, the winemaker, and they are both sons of winemakers who love Burgundy, and obviously they look at this style and really target Burgundian winemaking and style. Hence, you've got all this glorious fruit, but all these savory qualities. This is 2 different vineyard sources in Dundee Hills and Yamhill Carlton, sub-AVAs of Willamette Valley, predominantly Iron Filbert in Dundee Hills. And Evan was talking about earlier that, this wine nails that style in terms of really, delicious, ripe and tart fruit, but all the savory qualities. So everybody, I guess this is all to say, and I'm going to get to the Beaujolais people in just a second. All to say is, there's not one style of Oregon Pinot Noir. There's just not. And I think that's great, and that's how it should be. It would be like saying, well, California only has one style of Pinot Noir, which is just not true. Okay, to all the Beaujolais people, if this was Beaujolais Village, it would have carbonic and stem inclusion and be tutti frutti and all that stuff. What else?
Why not Beaujolais Cru?
Beaujolais Cru, it's not earthy enough.
Okay.
It's the wrong
That's
color.
what you meant. Okay.
And the acid is not, and frankly, the structure of the wine is wrong. Beaujolais Cru, even though they can be very generous, like Brouilly and Côte de Brouilly and Saint-Amour, they have a very firm granite acidic finish, and frankly, they're just different. Yeah, Maddie says granitic soils, absolutely. And there's the kids. Bless their hearts. That's great. Yeah.
Passing it down to a new generation.
Yeah, absolutely, which is what we need. Okay, so now we're going to do something completely different. We're going to wine number 4. And as you pull it up, everybody, and you look at it, compared to wine 3, yeah, just a little bit different. First of all, it is got a little bit more depth of color, but it is seemingly one of those lighter pigmented grape varieties also, but notice the color is tending towards garnet, which means what? 1 or 2 things, or 3. The wine's either older, it's been in oak longer, or it's a grape variety that oxidizes a little faster, and maybe, or a combination of all those things. Okay, so I'm going to call this a medium ruby garnet that's headed out to pretty much a garnet rim. Yeah. And in terms of tears, legs, la-di-da, it is medium plus as opposed to medium in the previous wine. And there is a tiny bit of staining of the tears. Okay. All right. With that on the nose. All right. Man, this could not be more different than the previous wine. Okay. So but we'll do categories of fruit here. Still predominantly red, but there's also black fruit. The red fruit is mostly sour cherry. It almost smells like dried cherry pits. And there's also little plum bordering on dried red plum and cranberry craisin, again, dried. What else? There's a little black fruit too, but again, like the previous wine, this is high tone black fruit like blackberries and black raspberries. But here the difference is, and it points back to the color, more evolved color. Here you've got maybe ripe and tart and also dried fruit. Okay, so this wine is evolved, a little bit more aged than the previous wine. Okay, what else? That's going to carry on through the rest of everything that's in the wine. And if I compare this to the previous wine, which I thought had a lot more fruit and certainly some savory, this wine for me is predominantly savory and earthy, right? The savory parts, dried rose petal, dried potpourri, which is dried anyway, star anise, what else? Red licorice, kind of a just dried savory herbs like oregano and bay laurel. The earth and mineral factor is both there. There's a very chalky, dusty quality. There's mushroomy and dried soil and leaves. And yeah, and then the wood is there also, but it's definitely older. Some wood influence, but again, it's like everything about the wine is dried, right? So it's evolved. All right. And then on the palate. So everybody used to take a taste of the wine, keep it in your mouth for about 5 seconds, and then swallow it. Okay, many things happening in fast sequence here. First of all, the acid compared to the previous wine, higher, definitely higher. Salivary glands, freaking out, right? Also, notice tannin, front of the mouth, back of the mouth, right? Both. So you've got some oak tannin, but you've got great tannin in the front of the mouth. Okay, so even though you've got a wine with, relatively speaking, lighter color, this wine it's got some tannin, and it's got grape tannin and some oak tannin. Okay, the finish to me is long, the complexity medium plus. Acidity is medium plus, not quite high, but it's elevated. My mouth is still watering, and the tannins too are medium plus, yeah, and wanting to go in higher. The alcohol is medium plus. Okay. All right, so there we go. What do we have? Do we have choices? Do we have questions?
I'm not revealing the choices. I think you guys gave, or when we set up this poll, we went a little too easy. So I'm not giving up the variety choices. I'm asking everyone to throw their answers into the chat, if you will. Let's make it double blind rather than single blind, right?
Lemang, one look at the label's worth $1,000. That's all.
Yeah, so going back to, yeah, I'm going to go back to Venkat's question about softer tannin. So Venkat, this wine, every time you taste it, the tannin gets amped up. Yes.
Yeah, the tannins are deceptive. They actually build rather than just sort of dry out. And I think what it brings up here is there's a difference between having ample tannin and having drying, astringent, unpleasant tannin. And this is a wine to me that has ample tannin, but the tannin management on it is such that while it pulls a little bit, the volume of it is actually reflected, to your point, cumulatively as you keep going back to it. And you notice that your mouth is getting fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier over time as more wine passes through.
And equally tart, because I want to make the point that if you really pay close attention, the acidity and the tannin are perfectly balanced, which, by the way, is a tell for this wine.
Yes, it is. Okay.
I'm throwing out the region choices for those. I think most people are looking at Italy right now, but I'm wondering if anyone's thinking New World at all here. So I think we have a lot of Old World guesses. So these were the choices. I think this kind of gives it away a little bit. Too easy. Right, Tim? I think
like Pinot Noir is Pinot Noir and Gamay are like Hello Kitty compared to this one.
Right, exactly. Which is why I held back on that. I think we are definitely ready to reveal this wine. And again,
Yes.
what an amazing group of tasters here. We're gonna leave France. Where in the world will we be in? Here we go. I love that Silka, who does our PowerPoints right now, really slowed down the Google
It
Earth.
makes a big difference when you slow them down.
Gives it
Yes, it
really
does.
nice suspense.
You don't get vertigo.
Yes.
Somebody
yes,
mentioned Nebbiolo, by the way. We should say that.
Yeah,
yes,
we're going to
yes.
talk about that in a second. So yes, here at Castello di Verrazzano, this is Chianti Classico, not to be confused with Chianti, because Chianti is a much bigger place. Chianti Classico, the original place, 1716, the Medici, on and on and on. Okay. Chianti Classico, unlike Chianti, can be made from 100% Sangiovese. This one is 95%. The other 5% is really not specified. It's probably, I'm thinking things like Colorino, Malvasia Nero, and things like that. Yeah, Castello di Verrazzano, the oldest cellar and winery in Chianti Classico, dating back to 1170. Yes.
Wow.
Okay.
Really? Yeah.
1170.
It's just remarkable. This to me is quintessential Chianti Classico. So I have to be Inigo Montoya and sum up. If there's a place in Italy for red wine that's shown the most improvement in the last 25 years, it's Chianti Classico. Because there was a Chianti Classico project 2000, and of course, being Italian, it ended in 2005. But they got the job done. And one of the most important things was clonal research. The consortium there took everything apart from how things were farmed, trellising. The most important thing was clones. And in Chianti Classico alone, not all of Chianti, they isolated 231 clones of Sangiovese. Wow. And so they took the top 7 clones, and then they isolated them in nurseries, government nurseries, and started propagating them, in 2005. And these were clones that gave best color, best aromatics, disease resistance, lower yields, things like that. And that's why there's been this dramatic improvement in Chianti Classico in the last, say, 15, 18 years. And also why there's a new category called Gran Selezione, because now the quality of the top wines, especially single vineyard wines, to me is as good as Brunello di Montalcino, which is a different animal, also made from Sangiovese. Okay, now we're going to get to the Nebbiolo questions. Okay, so all the Nebbiolo kids, this was, Nebbiolo, you pick it up, there would be orange in the rim, more evolved color. The alcohol would be higher, the acid would be higher, the tannins would be higher, and the wine would be floral. And not only that, just more non-fruit stuff. So unless it's Brunello, which by the time you get it per law is just older, it's like 5 years old. Usually Chianti Classico is not going to really stand up to a pretty basic Barolo, which is a bigger wine. Yep, and more evolved, always more evolved because it's a more oxidative grape. Okay. My 2 colleagues, I'm sure, have some profound things to say about
I
that
just
too.
want to tag team on the Brunello comment, because people will, if you have the happy problem of struggling between Chianti Classico and Brunello, one of the things that you can consider is the amount of oak on it, specifically new oak, and the quality of the tannin. And I would PS to your whole thing about what would pull you towards Nebbiolo in the simplest fashion. I think, and Evan mentioned this like almost an hour ago, that there is a quality of Nebbiolo tannin that is astringent. It's not even the amount of tannin, it's the quality of the tannin. It's mean. The son of a gun shuts the flavor down. It needs a lamb chop so that you can taste through the wine. That's my
right. There's a little bit of suffering that's involved with Nebbiolo.
Yes.
I love this picture.
Yeah, that's great.
I just want to clarify, Jerry made the comment, I am not saying that blind tasting is too easy. I was looking ahead at the deck and going, wait, we did what now? Put Gamay and Pinot as the 2 options for what
They all share acid. They all share high acid.
I know. I'm not making a judgment. I just made the call that it was too easy after the discussion we just had. So that's why I was like, I'm not showing the multiple choice.
All right, so everybody, now that we tasted these 2 wines, and there's a method to the madness, the way Evan puts these flights together. Now go back and taste the Pinot, and it is very solidly in the New World. It's a very savory wine, but in terms of earth and acidity, yeah, compare it to this Chianti Classico. Yeah, okay. This is a great A/B comparison, and you can see.
Fruit.
Yeah.
All right, let's move towards wine 5 and 2 points. Number 1, first of all, for those of you who are wondering in the back of your mind, particularly anybody on the East Coast, Verrazzano Bridge, Verrazzano Castello, same family, different generations, same people. The Verrazzanos were very, very powerful and important family emanating out of Tuscany. So the other thing I just wanted to mention, and you're probably figuring this together if you actually look at your 6 glasses, if you indeed are fortunate enough to have all 6 wines poured out side by side. These this flight of wines was designed as 3 duets. So 1 and 2 are actually meant to be looked at together. 3 and 4 meant to be sort of looked at together, and 5, 6 looked at together. So it seems like we're doing that naturally, but I also wanted to let you know that that was actually my motivation in putting this together. So let's enter that final duet and start with wine 5, obviously compared to 3 and 4. 5 and 6 are infinitely deeper, richer, and more pigmented than the prior wines are. But if you hold this wine against the light and look at it on a sideways thing, I wouldn't quite put it as opaque. I would say it's still a deep color, but towards the edges, I can literally read through it here. And I would say it definitely has sort of a purple, a rubyish vein with a sort of slightly faded ruby edge to it, but it is very consistent throughout. It's not sort of that really heavy extracted youthful purple color, nor is it starting to drop any color, which you would note by the levels of rim variation. Having more levels of rim variation from the center of the glass to the edge of the glass generally equals more age. If you only have 1, like you have here at the edge, probably not so much. So that's what's going on there. As I roll the wine around in the glass and I look against a piece of paper, I'll notice that the extract of color or the staining of the tears is relatively low and suggests to me both a highly pigmented grape, but not as much as Tim would say dry extract, or that is to say solids to juice combinations. This is sort of standard operating procedure as far as those things go. Now, as I smell it, breaking it down to sort of the fruit, earth, wood thing here, I'm sort of torn because I'm getting a lot of fruit, I'm also getting a lot of earthy sort of elements here, and clearly there is wood going on. So the fruit character I'm getting is definitely a combination of really ripe red, sort of in that cranberry, raspberry vein, but very much black. I'm getting blackberry, I'm getting black plum. I should say I'm probably getting red plum. If you get one, you usually get the other one too. And then notes of currant. And that actually is what's driving me here, is I'm picking up sort of a creme de cassis, black currant or red currant jam type thing going on there. It has non-fruit elements of mushrooms, particularly brown. I'm getting licorice, I'm getting anise, I'm getting tobacco leaf, probably more bordering on the full tobacco leaf, but actually with a nuance of pipe tobacco there. It's a little bit of that sweetness element. And this underlying earthy thing that is at once minerality, but a little bit of graphite or that sort of lead pencil thing as well. The oak here is deftly done. I would say it's pronounced. It is obvious, but it is not overwhelming, which I think is the issue most of us who are not as big oak fans as perhaps we were in our youth, like to see oak in balance as an attribute, as something that enhances, but not something that overwhelms here. And I definitely get sort of a cedar, cigar boxy, maybe slightly smoky element to it, but again, not overwhelming there. So this wine is very well built, very well packed together. It does have interesting fruit, non-fruit, earth, and wood elements all in one just lovely package. So 10 fingers and 10 toes, as they say in the palate. Very reflective of same. The things I'm obviously going to note in the palate beyond sort of a mirroring or an echoing of flavors would be anything different. So yes, Venkat, I neglected to mention the florals, which are actually now coming more out in the mouth to me. And I'm getting it once violet, perhaps a little bit of lavender as well here. And then again, sort of more of this generosity of earthy palate. Getting a bit of grit. The tannins here are what I would say probably medium plus, pushing to high, but once again, well managed, as not as smooth, if you will, as what we just had in our Sangiovese. Nevertheless, they're bigger, they're more ampler. They suggest perhaps a different genus or family of style, but also very deft tannin management so that you're not bringing out the austerity, the astringency, the bitterness, and all of those other elements. The wine has a medium plus acid, actually quite solid there. I would put the alcohol on it on sort of medium plus to high as I breathe through and measure my chest here. I've got some warmth, but certainly not glowing by any stretch of the imagination. And then the finish on it is quite long. I can still taste it. I would put the complexity level of this wine as extremely high, and I would tip my hat to the winemaker, who I think has done an incredibly deft job. I would say that it does not, unlike my earlier wine, come off like a singular voice. I definitely get different elements here, the fruits, the earths, the other stuff, would suggest to me a genus or a family of wines, all of whom are perhaps related, kind of like, you know, people in your choir, people in your band at some level, but not necessarily just the singularity of one voice. So I would probably put /blend for whatever I would do, again, just in my general head, and applaud once again the winemaker for doing a tremendous job.
Agreed. I put the guesses out there, show you guys here too. For those of you who are guessing along here, I'm just gonna get the spotlight off of Evan. No spotlight, here we go. Carmenere, Cabernet, Malbec. Contrary to the last one, these are all very, very close options. Evan, how do we decipher these varieties?
Well, they're all essentially related. I mean, they all do come from the same place at one place in time. I think your question here is which one is going to be dominant and which one is going to lead. In the case of Carmenere, Carmenere tends to always be led, even in the warmer places, by having a strong undercurrent of pyrozinic characters or greenish characters, bell peppery characters, jalapeno characters. In the best of cases, they're riper than that, so it's more like red and yellow peppers and not picking up the hardness of a green pepper, but you're going to have that element in there. The generosity and the weight will probably be the same. The tannins probably in line kind of with the Cabernet and all that. Malbec, I would probably not say is dominant here, although it could certainly be part of the blend. Malbec gives you generosity and fatness in the palate, for those of you who are thinking Argentinian, but if you notice, Argentina isn't a choice here. So Malbec from other places like Australia would probably be closer to Argentina. France, Malbec tends to be mean, not as mean as Nebbiolo, but Malbec literally translates to bad mouth in colloquial language, and that speaks to the inability over time for the grape to ripen sufficiently phenolically in France, which is why you have Argentinian consultants going back to Cahors now and telling them how to remake their Malbec there. So, and then Cabernet is a little bit of everything. You know, Cabernet is going to have elements of all of those things, and also just have more of a panoply of flavors. Not to say that great Carmenere and great Malbec are one-trick ponies by any stretch, they are not, but their band of flavors is not quite as broad as that of Cabernet, and I'm getting a broad sense of flavor here. So that would probably be, if I was a betting individual, which I'm not.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Andrea made a great comment. Evan, I know you say this to me a lot, that the wines are always changing in the glass. This goes back to your request that people open the wines sooner and let them breathe a little bit more. And are you seeing it with this wine as you taste through it?
Oh, I'm seeing it with all of the wines. I mean, I'm sure if anybody has any left in their glass, if you go back to wines 1, 2, 3, and 4, they're all changing too. The thing to remember is that when you rebottle a wine from a 750 into a 187, two things happen. One, you're going to go through immediate bottle shock, which air will help in time open up. Two, you're squishing this wine into a little bottle and it wants to get out. So the more air you can get it, the better. I'm always sighing, sadly, when people pop open a screw cap, drink it, try it immediately, and make a predetermination of what it is or whatever. Because these wines very much, and I always use the analogy of those little capsules of sponge that you drop into the bathwater of your child or your grandchild, and then they immediately turn into a flower or a dinosaur. But I think you need to let them unravel. You need to let the capsule shell dissolve and it to come out. Wines need time too, which is why we advocate at a minimal 15 or 20, but I concur with yourself and with Andrea that, 20 to 40. I find the wines start to show best at 40 to an hour personally, but you can't ask people to open up their wines an hour ahead of time. It's just unrealistic.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, Angel, I hear you. That's where I was first. I think we can reveal, and we're running a little short on time, so we're going to keep powering through here. So we're leaving Italy, and I think a lot
We're
of
leaving the
people-
continent.
Yes, we're leaving the old world.
We're leaving the hemisphere. We're popping
And
south. And
this
here
is so
we
crazy
are.
to me. Yeah.
We are in Australia, and specifically in that big country. We are in Western Australia, specifically in the area of Margaret River, and at the venerated home of Vas Felix, one of the great estates of this part of the world. They've been around since 1967 when Tom Cullity started this particular property. And Western Australia, I think, is probably the most undeserving, unloved part of Cabernet land that we don't talk about nearly as often as we can. I mean, we don't talk about Australia for Cabernet, frankly, as much as we can. We spend all of our energy on Shiraz. And when we do talk about Cabernet Sauvignon, we tend to be in, the center of the country. We tend to be in the Barossa. We tend to be places like that. But I would argue that, to me, Margaret River and Western Australia in general are the most Euro-styled of all of them. Think about the proximity to the water that you have there and how far south you are. Literally, you've got one stop and you're down at the South Pole. So this is actually, if you will, cooler climate Cabernet, which is going to pick up more on some of the herbal characters, pick up on all that. And as fruit doesn't get quite as ripe and doesn't get quite as jammy, it's not going to mask the fruit over. So when Tim was talking earlier about, the New World, Old World thing, oftentimes the New World wines, which demonstrate the most sense of place, tend to come from the coolest climates where you're not overrun by ripe fruit character. Not always easy to do there, but this is an absolute stunner. Vas Felix, along with Collins, and Lewin are probably my three favorite estates in this part of the world. But for Cabernet, I vacillate between Vas. Got that? Vacillate, Vas Felix and Collins for being my two favorite, of which these guys do a great job. It's a stunt double to me for a great Pauillac. This wine is 85% Cabernet Sauvignon, 11% Malbec. Good on you, whoever said Malbec earlier, and 4% Petit Verdot, which gives you a bit of backbone there. It is vines that have got some age on them. It's power and elegance at the same time. And Virginia there.
And it's
the
Virginia. Yes.
She is a, dare I say it without getting yelled at by my colleagues, she's a badass. That woman can make wine, and she's got such wonderful personality and is literally a wonderful ambassador for the Margaret River. Interesting factoid, just so that you know, there's one sort of predominant clone of Cabernet in this part of the world called the Houghton clone, which generally gives you lower crops, smaller berries, which when aggregated with the cooler climate really gives personality there. Those berries look a little gonflé, a little inflated to me. I'm used to seeing them a bit smaller, but maybe that's not Houghton clone. Who knows? And
that soil is just incredible.
Yeah, amazing.
Very, very, very complex. And she makes a point of talking about that. And I want to interject because the whole pyrazine issue, a lot of people relate it to either too cool for Cabernet or young vines. And if nothing else, Virginia's Cabernet shows you that you can have a Cabernet Sauvignon that's got pyrazinic elements, just a touch to give it complexity, and has nothing to do with being too cold or young vine. This is exceptional Cabernet fruit, but that little pyrazinic touch, along with everything else, is a tell for Cabernet.
Yeah, and by the way, remember that half of the parentage of Cabernet Sauvignon is Cabernet Franc, which is by definition a greener, leafier variety. And the best people these days making Cabernet Sauvignon lean into that green a little bit and don't just make it a jam jar or extracted oaky jam or whatever. So we like this. This is fun. Madeline, handing it off to you.
I have 2 minutes, so if you don't mind,
so-
whoever's answering questions,
A
we'll
couple
go
of things. I know that
Yeah.
we're not answering all the questions. We will answer the
Happy half
questions.
hour.
We're gonna let Madeline go. I'm sorry that we're running late.
Good
Madeline will
dialogue
go
today, though.
to
That's
really
okay.
good questions.
I'm always the caboose, and I'm always a little scrunched caboose, but that's okay. To that point, You know, we're looking at the color, and it's very interesting to compare 5 and 6 together. By the way, don't slam through the color. It's not a BS pointless exercise. It's part of the whole. And actually, if you just move the wine in the glass, you will see it adhere to the sides, which speaks to extract. Also, this color is a significantly brighter than the previous wine. This is not a good or bad thing. It just is. I'm paying close attention. I really can't see my finger through it, so it is opaque. And the very rim has violet highlights, which speak to purple tones, which speak to youth. And I will see if I'm inclined to speak just aromatically or aroma and palate together, but very forthcoming aromas, which have about 3 to 5 levels right out of the back. The first one is ripe fruit, dominantly red fruit, but with black fruit as well. And it's pulling me into raspberry land. So ripe raspberry fruit, and if I move into black fruit, black cherry, it's not verging into overripe. It's perfectly ripe, but there's a little bit of a dried element as well. And the quality of it is ideal. There is a wave of oak that makes perfect sense with this wine. It's not sitting on it. It's not commanding my attention, but you get oak spice. You also get what I call the Starbucks smell, which is that cool combination of sweet baking spices and chocolate and cocoa. I'm going to go ahead and take it on the palate, but I'm getting some garrigue elements like dried herbs. I'm not throwing you into France. I'm just using it as a category. And also green olives right on the nose. Let's see what happens on the palate, because I bet money there are going to be some secrets on the palate that are revealed. Immediately, I get a meaty element. And this is a vegan vegetarian talking, but you know, hey, I taste everything. So it's a little bit of a smoked meat character. It's subtle, and it's got a little bit of crusting of white pepper. The pepper is not commanding. That's why I'm calling it white instead of black. The olive element or flavor is expanded. There is on the palate somewhat more dried fruit. And you'll notice we do this. We're not being precious when we do it. We define the fruit, and then we will be qualitative about it in terms of fresh, ripe, overripe, dried, jammy. This can often be a little snapshot of where the wine is grown and the climactic influences. The quality, if I'm microscoping down to the palate, has interestingly balanced tannins and acid, not unlike how the Chianti did. This is a very different animal, because I would say that it's more, to use a hackneyed phrase, fruit forward. But the tannins are refined, though drying, definitely more drying than Pinot Noir, not hard. And the acidity is refreshing. So actually there's a citrusy element to this wine that is a surprise to me that I like very much. The other thing that strikes me is there's a perfect balance between the nose, the elements of fragrance and flavor, and the nose and the palate are very much interconnected. And that's the first time I perceived this in all of the wines that we're tasting. So there is a fulfilling element to this wine that I just love. It's delish, and what the aromas set you up for follow through on the palate. Is it long? Yes, but not what I would say very long. And I don't think that's a mark of, I don't think that's a demerit. I think that is a hint that the wine has a life to come. Quite often, if the finish is a little bit truncated, it might be indicating that the fact that the wine just needs a little bit more time. So red fruit dominates, followed by black fruit, ripe, verging on, in some elements, dried, but not overripe. There's no negative element there. Definitely green, olive and black olive, dried herbs, black and white pepper, though dominantly white, a little bit of meaty character and a balance between acidity and tannin. It's forthcoming, it's balanced. The fruit is leading the wine. And which grape variety? Cabernet Sauvignon blend, Tempranillo,
We've got a
Glenn,
lot of Syrahs in the mix here,
there's a
so
lot of, well, what was I describing? I mean, then to that point, and I wasn't doing it to make a point, but if you listen to yourself define, you will be describing the wine. So, it is a skill set that's essential if you are, practicing this blind tasting, and I suggest you consider it not a hellish exercise, but something that's fun, because the reality is, if you can learn that teeny little but essential skill set of perceiving, defining, and then listening to yourself with a little bit of a detachment, you are defining the wine, which is really cool indeed. I didn't define a whole lot of earth here. There's some earth in this element, but it certainly is more sort of turn dirt, clay, maybe a little bit of inorganic. It's not earth deficient, but earth doesn't drive the wine. It's not a major component on this wine. The finish just stopped. So I think it would make you happy, Lee Main, because we are 2 minutes into the happy half hour. This speaks, by the way, of very deft winemaking to me. People who are using very high quality fruit and not messing with it too much. We're leaving Australia.
Hi, Australia.
We're going across the Pacific Ocean. And yes, indeed, we are in California. We are in Ramey Wine Cellars. This is, with no exaggeration, an iconic name. David Ramey is really in the A+++ category of California winemakers who, at the beginning, well, I wouldn't say at the beginning of his career, but was a winemaker who really redefined California winemaking, initially with Chardonnay and then moving into red grape varietals as well. And the grapes are sourced for this Syrah from Sonoma Coast, and that's the appellation. But interestingly, it is Sonoma Coast, which is kind of like saying Texas, right? It's a pretty big area. This is not Fort Ross Seaview, right? We are moving a little bit inland. He is vineyard specific. Go to his website. If nothing else, you can check out his philosophy and process and read his published papers, which are just staggering on like how aromas develop in wine. This is mostly Coal Creek with some Rogers Creek. We are actually Russian River, in terms of location. And in terms of technical information, oh, by the way, this is not just a glamour shot on the right. He makes a point of telling us that it's very gravelly clay loam soils. 50% new oak, so it makes sense that you would perceive it, but it certainly doesn't annoy you. It is 80% Syrah, but this vineyard, specifically Coal Creek, is planted to a significant amount of Viognier that is indeed co-harvested and co-fermented. And whoever said he thought it was Northern Rhone Syrah, you've just made David Ramey a very happy man, because that is his inspiration in this wine. And, look how your mouth is still salivating. The flavor's gone, but feeling the tannin and feeling the acidity. So the influence, by the way, this guy, in terms of influence, he was the head of the pack of like raging against acidification, right? Using native yeast, no filtration, et cetera, et cetera. So that acidity is natural. And it's mouthwatering. And, I will say one little PS about my little love affair with Syrah, AKA Shiraz, as the Aussies will say, that it is the great, not only world traveler in terms of, okay, we're going to southern Portugal that is blazing hot. We are going to, Walla Walla. Where are we going next? It manages to travel the globe, but it also handles a really wide variety of microclimates and macroclimates. I think this is a reason why we should pay a lot more attention to quality New World Syrah and not just from Australia. Bravo, David.
So for those of you who can stay with us, we're going to stay on because there's so many questions, especially starting with this Syrah. And I want to just say, if you are on track to join us next month, Friday, August 12th, 1 p.m. Pacific. Please do. We would love to. And also pay attention.
Or if you're on vacation, which a lot of you will be, remember, you can always get the webinars online afterwards.
And you can
Also-
drink.
Yeah, and pay attention to our Instagram that first week in August. These guys don't know it yet, but they're going to Kristen, our first floor here in our new winery space, and we're going to be tasting how many wines, Evan? It's a little scary.
330, 340 next that week.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to document some of that on our Instagram, and you guys will have an insight into it. But if you can stay, we would love for you to stay. And as we're talking here, I'll let you guys also, I'll open up the options. Just be a panelist if you're staying, and you'll have the opportunity to ask your own questions and also put your camera on.